Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great Friday. I'm looking forward to the time that I have with you this morning. This is a passion of mine, helping entities understand human capital and why establishing them is critical for the growth of your business. Working with human beings is such a complex environment. It does require some investment in understanding the people that you're working with, understanding the legislative landscape that we find ourselves in as South Africans based on our history. So I'm very passionate about this. I love seeing entities really get to grasp with working with the people in their entities, seeing the entities grow and seeing the people grow just based on having some principles in place. So a little bit about me. I am the managing director of Meladi Human Capital. I've been in business. September is our 9-year anniversary. I'm a firm believer in education and upskilling yourself. So a little bit of a nerd in that regard, holding 3 degrees and continual improvement in terms of my knowledge. I'm a member of SABPP as well as Institute of People Management, which are HR-related bodies in South Africa. I also sit as the chair of REMCO for CAPASO, which is the Composers, Authors and Publishers Association with a footprint in South Africa and on the continent. So yeah, hopefully I'll be able to assist your entities to grow the same as I've managed to do with others for the last 9 years. So what are the ways of establishing robust and sound human capital practices in your entities? I've coined it another word that starts with C, but I've coined it to 5 C's. That is compliance, culture, which is made up of communication, consistency, and consequence management. So all of those 5 C's together should help entities make sure that they establish sound human capital practices. So I'm going to take you through all 5 of them. Hopefully we'll have sufficient time. And if there needs be, maybe we could do a follow-up webinar on any of the others. First up, compliance. South Africa has got a history with apartheid where the majority of people, particularly Black, Indian, and colored people, were actually taken advantage of, and a number of their rights were taken away. And so the union labor movement was very instrumental in making sure that those wrongs were righted. And some people believe that now we've gone to the other extreme end of the spectrum in terms of creating an environment where we're so onerously regulated in South Africa that it sometimes amounts to being a difficult place to do business. But knowledge is always power. And one of the things that can help anyone get around any kind of complex situations or challenging situations is to actually arm yourself with knowledge. So we have a number of legislations. We have the common law, which is when you take the interpretation of legislation to court. And in our judicial system, it goes all the way up to the Constitutional Court. So we have entities such as the CCMA, the Labour Court, the Labour Appeals Court, and like I said, the Constitutional Court, which helps us interpret the laws that Parliament creates. We have contracts, employment contracts that we sign with our employees, and that is governed by both labor legislation as well as still the law of contract. So you would have seen as an example in the Moyo versus Old Mutual case, Mr. Moyo chose to take his conflict with his employer to the High Court instead of using the channels of the CCMA and Labour Court because he felt that they had breached his contract in terms of law of contract and not necessarily labor legislation. We have policies which are developed by employers that go together with procedures, and we have practice. We need to be mindful that the things that we do every day, even if we don't write them down, they become practice, they create precedents. And a lot of the time, employees will call you out on it. Oh, you did this for so-and-so. So the assumption is that you'll do it for me as well. So we need to be mindful that the things that we do that become practice and precedent also actually become part of our working environment and the compliance they're in. Okay. Legislation. There's more than this, but these are the ones that are critical for day-to-day in managing your entities. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act is exactly as it states there. It's what is the bare minimum that employers need to do to make sure that they're compliant with labor legislation in this country. So it looks at working hours, it looks at your leave, it looks at your overtime, it looks at how and when you terminate employment with employees. So this is a critical piece of legislation, and it's one of the reasons why the Department of Labor wants every employer to put it up on their wall for employees. It does come in a number of languages as well. So we need to make sure that we are fundamentally compliant with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, particularly where we have vulnerable employees. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act go hand in hand with sectorial determinations, the last bullet on this page. So there are some industries that have unique circumstances to them. You can imagine security, the retail sector, students, children, they're in adverts and movies and things like that. That is considered work. You have people in agriculture, etc. So they don't have the normal 8 to 5, Monday to Friday kind of work. And so government is cognizant of that, and they create what is called sectoral determinations. So in those sectors, that is what determines the working hours, etc. So if any of you are in any of those unique industries, you need to pay attention to those sectoral determinations. We then have the Labor Relations Act. So this is the act that most employers are afraid of. This is the act that employees take you to CCMA for, and no employer wants to be at CCMA. Number one, it's a very long day. And if you're running your own business, you can ill afford to spend a day at the CCMA. So it's in your best interest to understand the parameter, the framework around labor relations. And one of the main things around labor relations is consistency. Be consistent as an employer in how you treat your employees. Be consistent, give them fair time to represent themselves, but mostly make sure that they actually know the rules. There are rules that are determined in terms of legislation, and there are rules that you determine as an employer in terms of your policy. So the Labor Relations Act also establishes the CCMA, establishes the Labor Court, establishes the Labor Appeals Court, and takes us through all of the steps that you do when you go through that appeals process. So primarily that's what that act does. It's got additional regulations to it, which talk about sexual harassment, which talk about poor work performance, which talk about incapacity in terms of illness, etc. So it is an important piece of legislation, but it's not complicated. It's really around fairness, and we can go into a bit more detail around that. Employment equity, that's based on our history, making sure that we treat everyone fairly. You cannot employ someone because they're pregnant, as an example. They can take you to CCMA for unfair labor practice. So we need to be mindful how we conduct ourselves in our engagements with employees or potential employees from day one. Skills Development Levy Act, we pay 1% to SARS for that. That's encouraging all of us to continue to upskill ourselves and make sure that our employees upskill themselves as well. I always have a question from employers that says, if I invest in that person and then they leave me, am I not disadvantaged? And my answer is always, if you don't invest in them and their skills become redundant and you keep them in your business, are you not still disadvantaged? So unfortunately, we cannot control whether people come in or out of our business, but what we can do is make the business as conducive, the environment as conducive as possible while they're in the business, so that we can have as much of their value be beneficial to our businesses while they're there. Okay. We have the Commission for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. If you're my age, you know it as the Workplace Diseases Act. So Workmen's Compensation Act, I beg your pardon. But it's been renamed the Commission for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. So if anyone has an injury at work, they will pay for the medical expenses based on their review of that. Occupational health and safety really came into the spotlight with COVID. They made amendments, they gazetted additional regulations for that, but that act has always been there. It's really around making sure we have a safe space for people that work for us, making sure that we have the fire hazards and everything like that. there's been a number of mining companies, etc., which have been sued retrospectively because people have had lung disease, or asbestos companies, people have fallen ill, etc., because they didn't comply with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and PPE and certain things like that. They've been taken to court for that. 4B Act also came into the spotlight last year, making sure that we protect the information of our employees. So not have their files lying around, not have everyone have access to pay slips and payroll and things like that. So what some might deem common sense around confidentiality and privacy, but it's the government has seen that it needs to actually be extended so that it's not careless around it. So you'd find at construction sites, people will leave their CVs with the site manager, and next thing they're flying in the wind. It's to stop that kind of behavior. Due care needs to be taken with people's personal information. Protected Disclosure Act, there is an act for whistleblowing. It doesn't sometimes feel like it in South Africa because our whistleblowers get victimized, but there is actually an act that protects them. And as employers, depending on the size of entity that you are, the Companies Act does actually legislate that certain employers have to have a fraud hotline or whistleblowing line so that either employees or third parties are able to report whatever fraud that they come up with or corruption, etc. We have the Employment Services Act. Those of you who are using temporary employment recruitment services or recruitment agencies, the rules on how they're supposed to conduct themselves are in the Employment Services Act. Remember that you become co-employer with your temporary employment services provider. It also regulates foreign nationals, the work permits, what are the processes you need to do as an entity before you actually can recruit foreign nationals. It also promotes the employment of youth and other things. National minimum wage, that came into the spotlight probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And they've slowly introduced it to agricultural workers as well as domestic workers. So on an annual basis, the Department of Labor reviews that. So you need to make sure that you're in compliance with that. Okay, and judgments, they're important. They help us interpret the law. The parliamentarians don't always know what they're doing. So the judges help us with that. Okay, as an employer, you need to make sure that you're registered with UIF. If you don't have this right, you could end up in a lot of trouble with the Department of Labor. I ask all of you, because I come across this, where your accountant will register you with UIF through SARS, but they don't register with UIF through the Department of Labor. You need to make sure that you have 2 UIF numbers, one with SARS and one with the Department of Labor. And I implore you to, all of you, be registered on UFiling so that you can do your monthly contributions. Who are the employees in your employ for that month? What have you contributed for them for that month? Pay as you earn is important. There is something called an SIC code, sector industry code, that says which sector are you in, so that it links you to the sector education training authority that you're in. So it links your skills development levy as well. So everything is linked. If you open your business and you start off as an accounting practice, and then you later want to go into construction, it's at this point, your SIC code that you change with SARS, okay? Between the SARS and the CETAs, they will take you from pillar to post, changing this. So it's important that you actually do understand the terminology that they all use. So it's your sector industry code that determines where your SDL money goes and which CETA you can then claim from for skills development, okay? Skills development is paid by you, the employer, 1% on a monthly basis of salaries if your salary bill is over 500,000 at any given point in time. The other compulsory strategy registration is your COID, which you then pay on an annual basis. Those of you who do business in mining, construction, or with government, they sometimes ask for a letter of good standing, a logs, and that you only get once you've paid this. So consequences of non-compliance, other than having the Department of Labor harass you perpetually to make sure that you're compliant, you actually can have a criminal record or criminal case opened against you by your employees or the Department of Labor for non-payment, for example, of UIF or COID. If, for example, you have a provident fund in your business and you also don't pay that, you could have a criminal case opened against you. A good example of this is currently the ANC. They have not paid over UIF and pay as you earn to SARS, and I think the DA has opened a criminal case against them. So this criminal case would go against the directors of the company, and you end up with a criminal record. So even if you pay a fine to avoid imprisonment, you still have that record on your person. So it's critical to understand the consequences thereof. There are common law duty things that your employee owes you. I find a lot that because of the onerous legislative landscape that we have, employees are scared to engage their employers, I beg your pardon, are scared to engage their employees on some basic fundamental things. Your employee must come to work. They must make their services available. If they can't come to it because they're sick or otherwise, they must tell you. But you just can't have people loafing around. They owe you a duty to make their services available. They owe you a duty to make sure that they are competent in what it is that you have hired them to do. So if they're not competent and you've done everything that you can to help them be competent, you are not obliged to retain that person in your company, because you are there to make sure that you're able to sustain the business for everyone there. Do not feel trapped and thinking that the labor legislation is so onerous. You do have got rights as employers, similar as employees have. Employees must act in good faith. Conflict of interest, doing other things during work time, etc., is completely unacceptable. You hire them on the basis of trust, and they need to make sure that they can live up to that expectation. And the employee-employer relationship is a subordination relationship, so they have to obey your commands as long as they're lawful and morally sound. And if they don't, it is exactly that, insubordination. So be aware of your rights as an employer, what you're entitled to from your employee. And as an employer, be aware of what you have to do. You must pay the person, pay the people. Don't be like the ANC. Pay the people. If you can't, one of the other C's that we have is communication. Communicate to your employees. Let them know that you're going through a bit of a bump, and how and when you'll be able to assist them. Send letters to their banks indicating that, you know, the salaries are delayed a little bit, etc. Assist them where possible during that rough period. So communication is really, really important if you are going through issues as an employer. Create a safe working environment. Again, in terms of occupational health and safety, tools of trade, provide your employees with tools of trade. You cannot claim an employee is incompetent if you have not given them the necessary tools to do their work. Okay, and payslip. I find that a lot of employers don't actually give their employees payslip. It's a duty. You have to give your employee a payslip. Okay. Employment contract. One of the things I also find is employers will download a contract and give it to employees, and then it talks about the laws of Australia. So already that's problematic. You need to make sure that you have the right contract that talks to the right legislation or jurisdiction, so that it's a legally sound contract. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act actually tells you what are the minimums you need to have in your contract. So it's things like the name, ID, etc. of the person, the working conditions, who they report to, and some of the rules and regulations that you would have as an employer. It's to your advantage as an employer to have a contract. In there, you can have clauses such as restraint of trade. You can have clauses around your working hours, etc. So there's a number of things that you as an employer can actually put into your employment contracts, so that they're legally sound, so they protect your interests while they comply to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Permanent employee contracts, these are terminated by resignation, dismissal, retirement, or death. So that's exactly that. It's a permanent employee. They're not there for a fixed amount of time, unless you call retirement a fixed amount of time. But they're usually for a month up to any number of months. Employees who earn below the income threshold as determined by the Department of Labor of 211,596.30 cents. They are heavily protected by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act because they're considered the most vulnerable. Their fixed term contract is limited to 3 months, but there are a number of exceptions as to those fixed term contracts. Number one, for example, our maternity leave legislation in South Africa says maternity leave is 4 months. So if someone is a temp or on a fixed term contract for someone on maternity leave, automatically that's 4 months, in more often than not. So that's an exception. It's specified to a specific action. So that's an exception for the 3 months. And another exception is where you have a project, say you're constructing something and it's a 12-month project. So that construction would be an exception. It's a project-specific fixed-term contract. Learnerships tend to be 6 months to 12 months. That's also another exception. Employers who have less than 10 employees are also exempted from this legislation, and employees who have maybe up to 50 employers who maybe have up to 50 employees but have been in business for less than 2 years are also exempted from this. So there's a number of other exemptions, quite detailed. Section 198B of the Labor Relations Act actually itemizes all of those exemptions. There's also independent contractors. They're not employees. You're literally hiring their services, for a specific outcome. So a graphic designer is giving you a certain design, and they come in and out, and they generally have more than one client. It happens a lot in the technology space where, for example, you have SAP consultants, etc. So it is important for you to understand which type of contract are you entering into for your business, how long it's going to be, are you at any point in time going to fall foul of the law, and for you to actually rectify it, because employees are then able to take you to CCMA for contravention of that Labor Relations Act clause. All right. Policies. This is where, as employers, you have a bit of leeway. So as long as they're legally compliant, you can put just about anything into your employee handbook as policies. These serve as a guide to employees. As human beings, we work very well within structure. It's good for us to know our boundaries. What is it that we can and cannot do in this environment? So if you were working at Coca-Cola, the policies might be slightly different to Pepsi. Because at Coca-Cola, they've decided that this is the way that we do things here. And at Pepsi, they've decided otherwise. So they speak to the company culture and values, the ways of working. It's important that where your policies are in place, that your employees know about the policies. There's been a number of CCMA cases where the first question that the commissioner will ask you is, did you know about this law? Because your employer is claiming that you broke it, about this rule. Because your employer is claiming that you broke it. And if as an employer, you're not able to show, this is the policy, I inducted Michael and he signed that he understood all our policies. So Michael knew about the rule in the organization. So that's where policies really play a vital role, where something is not legislated, but it's a way of working, the way that we do things here. It's important that it's documented in policy form. So examples of some of the policies that you can have. It's any number of policies. Dress code, for example. It's not the same in all environments. In some areas, jeans and a t-shirt is good. In others, it's not. One thing to know about dress code is that if you're going to insist on employees wearing your uniform, you need to pay for that uniform. But what you can say as an employer is that I give you a uniform for 2 years. If you lose it within that 2 years, you are then liable to replace it because it is a condition of your employment that you have this uniform. So I'll give it to you every 2 years, or every year you get a new uniform, etc. You write that in your dress code policy. It's easy for everyone to see. And if everyone breaks that rule, you refer to the policy. You were inducted on it, do better. Okay. Things like your employee development policy. A lot of employers will say, we are a learning environment. We want to make sure that people do their best, etc. But what does your employee development policy speak to that? Do you have one? Does it outline how much support you give to your employees in terms of paying for their studies or in terms of giving them time off for their studies? Study leave is one of the leaves that's actually not legislated. You as the employer have got carte blanche to decide on your study leave policy. A lot of the time, employees take it as part of their annual leave if there isn't a study leave policy in place. But if you're an employer whose culture is around learning and development, this is really one of the areas where you can demonstrate as an employer that you believe in that value of learning. Social media, this is a policy that was developed a few years ago. I'm sure you all remember Penny Sparrow. And what she said on Facebook then blew up and affected her employers, previous or otherwise. There was the guy on the Greece beach. His utterances impacted his whole family business. So as an employer, it's important for you to set out the rules and guidelines to your employees of how they need to conduct themselves on social media platforms. You're within your rights to ask them not to indicate who they work for on their platforms, for an example, to protect yourself as an employer. Vaccination policies, big debate around, do we vaccinate or not vaccinate? Again, as an employer, there are obviously parameters within which, if you say you have a mandatory vaccination policy, there are parameters within which you need to make that assertion. So have you done your risk management assessment, etc.? Or are you an employer who says, no, we don't worry about that. You don't need to be vaccinated. It needs to be clear to your employees. Leave is another important policy. While the Basic Conditions of Employment Act gives you a framework, gives you the basic minimum, you as an employer could decide, for example, that your management team should get 20 days or 25 days instead of the statutory 15 days or 1 day leave for every 17 days worked. And so you need to say that in your policy. You need to say what are the conditions around that. Do they have to take it within a certain period of time? Is it if they terminate their services that they cannot actually get that extra leave paid out, etc.? So you need to be clear around the parameters within which you do certain things, particularly when they're over and above the legislation. Your grievance, harassment, and disciplinary policies are very important. Again, there are minimums that are prescribed by legislation. For example, you need to give a minimum of 48 working hours for an employee to be able to respond to or to attend a disciplinary inquiry. That's the minimum. But as an employer, you can decide you want to give 5 working days or whatever the amount is. So you need to articulate that in a policy and make sure that you disseminate that information to your employees. Culture. Everything we do and say, the way we think, the way we communicate, our processes, our policies, our procedure, every single little thing talks to our culture. We all create our 3, 4, or 5 values as we begin our business. One popular one, which I see is getting less popular, is respect. We all come from different households. Respect to me is not the same as respect to Michael or any of the other people. So we need to be able to define it in our spaces. What does it mean to show respect at XYZ company? Does it mean that there's no call that goes unanswered, there's no email that goes unanswered, there's no client that's left unattended, because we respect ourselves as a company and we're going to make sure that our clients and our employees feel that respect through those actions. And as leaders, we need to make sure that our communication, direct or indirect, speaks every single day to our culture and values and what we want to build. The way that we budget, if we say that we're an organization that puts people first, how do we demonstrate that in our budgeting? How do we demonstrate that in our reward and recognition? What are the everyday things that we do to make people feel valued in our organization? It can't just be lip service. One of the entities that I worked for, the CEO there used to say, culture is about the smell of the place. How does it smell here? Are we putting in roses, or are we putting in other things in this place in our everyday action? People always self-regulate and go back to what they know, go back to their own roots. But culture is an everyday thing in the way that we talk, the way that we address people in our actions, the way that we allow written communication to go out, whether it's internally or externally. It's important that we understand when we say these are our values, how do we live them every day? How do we demonstrate? Because human beings, you'll see even from a primate perspective, we are a doing nation. Words can only go so far, but our communication is verbal, non-verbal, etc. It's in every single thing of every single day. Like I said, with values, they can't just be 3 to 5 words on a wall. We have to define them. What do they mean to us in this organization? And do little things around values every day. A value like we're an entrepreneurial organization. How do you promote that? How do you celebrate that? How do you acknowledge that? How do you encourage customers to give feedback so that you know that your people are living the values? How do you as a leader engage with people every day so that you can suss out whether is what I dreamt of those many, many years ago when I created this entity, is it coming alive? Am I still actively participating in these values that I set out at the beginning of my entity? And communication, encourage open and honest communication, create safe spaces. As entities get bigger and bigger and bigger, we lose the essence of what it is that got us up in the morning and why we created the entities that we created. If we don't take our people along, if we don't converse with them, if we don't give them feedback, a lot of managers go on a strat session and then it sits there, it sits at Exco. Why is your strategic objective not drilled down right down to every single person in your entity? Receptionist, the cleaner, the admin person, the security, every single person should be communicated to, engage with as to where the business is going, what we're doing well, what we're not doing well. Give us suggestions. How can we do better? What's your perspective? We tend to lose that, and we in the process lose a lot of gems around extracting value from our people. So take people along and be transparent. And very important, no one reads minds, guys. So we don't know the vision until you tell us what is the vision, until you interpret it for us and make it easy for us to understand, get us to buy into that vision. And every single day, we'll all be conscious of our actions. Do they talk to the vision? Do they talk to the values? Are we together building this entity instead of creating a management and employee kind of chasm, where we get further and further and further apart, because it's your people who actually either take you up or they will bring you down. The last C is around consistency. So again, be consistent in your behaviors and actions. If we said one thing today, we need to be consistent and say it again tomorrow. If we can't be consistent, let us say why we cannot be consistent. What has changed in our environment that says we need to change our behavior and action as well, and take people along as to that thinking. We really don't read minds. We need to know why are things happening. Generally, human beings are curious people. And if we don't tell them, if we're not consistent, then people start creating their own narratives and their own stories. And then you wake up one day and you're wondering, why is my environment so toxic? And you have to take a look at yourself as a leader in that organization to understand what has been your contribution to that toxicity. Okay, so be consistent in how you apply your policies, your reward structure, your discipline, everything. Be consistent. Then people start to have a safe space. They start to know, okay, if this, then this. It then leads to your consequence management being streamlined, whether it's positive or negative. People then know what to expect. You've communicated it, you're consistent about it, they behave accordingly. But if you're erratic about your consequence management, you will get an erratic feedback from your people. They will react directly. So reward good behavior, manage performance that's not in line, manage poor performance, hold each other accountable as organizations. Like I said, you've gone to a strat session, come back with those strategic objectives and roll them out to every single person in the entity so that they feel that they're part of the bigger picture, and they will act knowing that as a collective, they contribute to the bigger vision. And once you've achieved that success, again, reward accordingly, reward everyone who's played ball, who's participated, invest in your employees. It's not always about money for employees. They spend the most amount of time at work with you. 9 times out of 10, they want to do their best. They want to grow as people. They want to make sure that they have something to look back on in terms of their career that they can be proud of. So give them the space, give them the consistency, give them the transparency and the honesty to be able to do that. So in conclusion, human beings require structure and direction. They require leadership, recognition and reward, and they require boundaries. And really those 5 C's is how you go about establishing really good human capital practices in your entity.